Now I taught the weeping willow how to cry, and I showed the clouds how to cover up a clear.
So I introduced myself as being in the guitar business. He said, yeah. I said, we got this new revolutionary guitar. I'd love to show it to you. So he said, well, we're staying over at the Holiday Inn over in Eatontown, New Jersey, which happened to be about 2 miles from the Kramer Guitar Factory. And he said, why don't you come over tomorrow morning around 9, 10 o'clock? Well, this is why God does things in strange places. I show up at the Holiday Inn the next morning. They were expecting another guitar company, somebody that Marshall had hooked up with. The guy doesn't show up, and here I'm there, and they thought I'm the guy. So they let me in and with open arms, and I show them this new guitar and new bass. Man, they freaked out, and I drove them back to the factory, which, like I say, might have only been 2 miles away. And needless to say, that night at the Garden State Arts Center, the entire Johnny Cash band played Kramer guitars. Marshall played a Kramer bass. Jerry Hensley, who was a cousin of June, I believe, he played a custom Kramer guitar, and Bob Wooten, the lead guitar player, was on with a damn brand new Kramer guitar, and they loved him. So that's how I first met John. But again, I introduced myself as being in a guitar business. So for the next 5 or 6 years, as I would sneak around to the shows, because I got to be friendly with Bob and everybody, I'd get tickets, backstage passes. They thought of me as Henry the guitar maker. During those years, I had a hobby, and I did big game sport fishing. And I used to go to this little island in the Bahamas called Bimini. So I would go down there and I would marlin fish, I would tuna fish, and man, I caught some fish. Big stuff. I mean, I think the biggest marlin that I caught was 518 pounds. I caught a tuna that was well over 1,000 pounds that the sharks ate before I got him in the boat. And all I had is the head and the backbone. And anyway, I'm telling Bob Wooten a story about my fishing trips, and he said, man, I'd love to go fishing. So I invited Bob and Earl Ball, the piano player, to come to Bimini on a fishing trip. They come down there, and lo and behold, on the first trip, Bob Wooten hooks into a giant tuna. He eventually lost the fish, but that experience, to have him fighting this tuna, it looked like a depth charge exploded when it hit the line. And Bob's fighting this fish. He could not believe this, and he went crazy. And the shame is we lost the fish, and we never hooked onto another tuna, but he was hooked. So he says, Bob says, boy, Johnny would love this. I said, you think he would come? He says, I'm sure. Why don't you ask him? I said, no, I can't ask him. So Bob asked him. So the next time, by this time, I was pretty friendly with the guys in the band and with John and June. And I forget what show we're at, but we're backstage. And John says to me, he says, Bob's telling me about this fishing trip you guys made to Bimini. He said, man, I'd love to go. I says, you would? He said, I'd love to go. And we fly down to Bimini. Johnny flew out of Nashville, and I flew out of New York, and we met him at the airport. We stayed at a place called the Bimini Big Game Club, and we went out fishing. And I had the most incredible time because I really got downtime, just relax with Johnny Cash. It was, I mean, you know, I'm in heaven. I mean, and we just really, really hit it off. I mean, we talked about everything, how he used to go fishing in a little pond with a wood stick and a string and a worm, and, you know, it was just incredible. And he asked me about my family, want to know my family's background, and I told him. And my dad was a doctor, and my father used to take care of all the poor black patients in town that nobody wanted. And he says, really? And I said, yeah. And I told him that my father had office hours 7 days a week, made house calls every night till 1, 2 in the morning. My mother was his nurse. I mean, he would see sometimes 80, 90 patients a day. He had office hours even on Sunday. So I told Johnny, and I told John that my dad was knighted by the Pope, and it was knighted into the Order of St. George in Katrina. And a courier was sent over from Rome and knighted my dad at this big testimonial dinner at the Berkeley Carteret Hotel in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And after the dinner, in a tuxedo, my father made house calls. Made house calls till 2 in the morning. My cousin Freddie Vaccaro, who was my father's first cousin, went and made house calls with him, just give him, you know, just to stay with him. And he recalled that one of the patients said, "Here comes Jesus Christ," and he's dressed in a tuxedo. Well, my father was on cloud nine. The next night he went to sleep and he died in the middle of the night of a massive heart attack, 51 years old. I told Johnny that story, and Johnny was really impressed with that. But I get home and I get a package in the mail from the House of Cash, which was Johnny's office. In that package, which was a Federal Express package, I opened it up and I started crying. That cross that Johnny had worn around his neck, he had it encased in solid gold. And on the back was an inscription, "To my friend Henry, in memory of your father Sebastian, J. Cash, Easter, 1983. That's my most cherished possession. That shows the real depth and character of this man that I came to know and love. I think it was also the year 1983. Johnny was making a movie in Georgia called Murder in Coweta County. He invited me down for 10 days while the movie's being made, and boy, I was in heaven. I flew down to Atlanta. They had a car from the shooting company or the production company picked me up at the airport and took me to the backwoods of a little town called Griffin, Georgia, where the movie was made. The movie was the true story of a sheriff and a land baron, and Johnny played the sheriff, and the land baron was played by Andy Griffin. And it was a true story of how this land baron killed a person, and he was convicted by the testimony of a black man, the first time in the history of the South that a white man was convicted by the testimony of a black slave. I'm on Johnny's tour bus, and they used the tour bus as their dressing room. And so I'm in there, and John's out shooting, and what I remember is I'm in there, just June and myself, and you know, she's telling me, she says, "Well, tell me a little bit about where you come from, Henry." So I told her about Asbury Park, New Jersey, and I said, "That's my hometown." And Asbury was run down. It was a fabulous seashore resort town in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and then it started to deteriorate like a lot of older seashore towns because its stock of old wooden hotels either burnt down and never kind of got replaced. And we had riots in the late 60s, and it just, you know, the town was really struggling. And I told her about it, and I showed her some pictures. I showed her a picture of an old hotel. It was, at the time, a 450-room hotel called the Berkeley Carteret. I told her that I'm buying a hotel. And she says, "You are?" And I said, "Yep." And she says, "I recall," she says, "my mama telling me something about playing in Asbury Park." Now, her mother was Maybelle Carter of the famous Carter family, really the first family of country music. And June is telling me about her mother telling her about Asbury Park. And then June also told me a story that the feature story on the Life magazine in December 1941 was to be the Carter family. Except something happened on December 7th, 1941, which we all know, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it just pushed the Carter family right off the cover. But it was interesting just to, you know, hear her talk about her family and so forth. So Johnny now comes on the bus after his shooting. He's got a break, and the first thing he does is grab the Coca-Cola, and he sits down and wipes the perspiration off his forehead, and June says, "Why, John, look what Henry's wanting to buy." And he said, "What's that, Henry?" And I showed him the pictures. He said, "That's some convention center." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, if you buy that," he says, "I want to open that up for you. I want to be the first performer in that new convention center." I said, "John," I says, "I would love to do that." And he says, "I'm going to do it for nothing." He says, "You're my friend." I said, "Johnny, I can't accept that." "What do you mean?" I says, "I'm your friend, not to take from you, but to be a true friend." I says, it will be an honor to have you open that place up, but I want to pay you like anybody else pays you. But if you want to take that money and invest it in a hotel, maybe we could do something." So he says, "That sounds interesting." So unbeknownst to me, he calls Nashville, and his accountant flies out from Nashville to Atlanta. And the next day we meet him, and he explains to the accountant what I wanted to do. And he says, I want you to go to Asbury Park and look at this hotel, and if it's what Henry says it is, he says, we got a deal. He reached out his hand and shook my hand, and Johnny Cash became my first investor in the Berkeley Carteret Hotel. I still have the original documents and with his signature on it, June's signature, and blessed by their accountant, and that's how we got started in business, restoring this grand hotel. So, that's just kind of some of the story.
Now I taught the weeping willow how to cry,